This is your brain. This is your brain on technology. What growing up with technology means to the evolution of your brain.
Technology train is way out of the station, is charging down the track. Question is, how are we going to adapt?
Your brain on technology. And Dr. Gregory Petsko on the aging brain. Part 3 of Mysteries of the Mind Week. That's tonight on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin.
And joining us now on the line from Waltham, Massachusetts, just outside Boston, Gregory A. Petsko. He is professor of biochemistry at Brandeis University. Professor, thanks for joining us on the line there. I just want to start by asking, what physically happens to the human brain as it ages?
Well, some interesting changes occur. So one of the things that happens as you age is your brain gets smaller, about 10% in volume for every 10 years or so after the age of 40. Another thing that happens to it is it turns brown. If you look at a very old brain, it has a brownish color to it, quite different from the brain of a younger person. Now, you might wonder whether or not those changes are actually harmful in any way, and the answer is people don't really know. But personally, you know, if somebody asked me, do you want the small brain that looks like it's been in the toaster too long, I think I'd pass on that.
You'd go for the younger one.
Yeah.
That makes sense. How does the aging process in the brain increase the risk of seniors developing, you know, those degenerative disorders that everybody's afraid of, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, etc.?
For reasons that we don't understand, as you get older, accumulations of misfolded proteins occur in the brain. Protein molecules, there are about 100,000 different ones in the human body, have to be folded properly in order to function. Sort of like a paper airplane would have to be folded right in order for it to fly.
So when you say folded, you really mean folded?
I really mean folded.
Okay.
It folds up into a compact and properly formed shape. But the problem is that for reasons that are not clear, especially as you get older, sometimes proteins unfold or misfold, and the unfolded or misfolded proteins can aggregate into clumps of misfolded proteins, and for reasons that we don't understand, those are toxic to neurons. They kill nerve cells, and they're especially toxic to cells of the central nervous system, like the cells of the brain.
Do we know why it happens?
We don't entirely know why it happens. Long-term exposure to what is called oxidative stress may be part of it. That's a chemical stress that's caused by the fact that we breathe and metabolize oxygen, which is a highly reactive compound. And there are other reasons that are thought to contribute. Exposure to pesticides in some cases may contribute to things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. But frankly, the cause of most of these is unknown. Now, a small percentage of them are genetic and run in families. But those cases are rare, and they're due to mutations in specific genes.
Okay, you are also president of the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and I wonder what new research you're seeing these days that is changing the way that you have come to understand this topic.
So there are, I think, 3 types of research that are making an enormous difference to how we understand the impact of aging on the brain. The first is our ability, and this is new, to actually look inside functioning brains, examine what's going on, see the effects of neurons dying through techniques like PET scanning and functional magnetic resonance imaging. They've given us pictures of the development of these diseases from a much earlier point in time, and that's very important. The second thing that's happened that I think is tremendous is human genetics, those rare genetic cases of these diseases that I told you about. We now know from genomic studies on families that have these diseases which precise genes are mutated and that give rise to the inheritable form of the disease. The mutations are in genes that have a particular function. The proteins coded for by those genes do things. They belong to certain pathways and processes in the cell. And that's given us clues as to how these diseases start and how they progress. And the final thing I think that's been exciting is partly building on the results of the first 2 things I've talked about. There have been some new ideas for therapy. So one idea is maybe you can make a drug that works like molecular Scotch tape and hold the folded protein together so that it doesn't tend to unfold or misfold so much. That might actually prevent the disease from developing in the first place. And there are a lot of companies and a lot of academic labs that are excited about those sorts of prospects.
Fascinating. Okay, let's get into some discussion about how large an issue this is going to become in the years ahead. Of course, the population of the world is aging. What percentage, do you have a speculation as to what percentage of the world's population today suffers from these kinds of degenerative neurologic disorders?
It's hard to say that for the entire world because there's so little data coming out of many countries. But let me put it in the context of Canada. So right now, there are about 33.5 million Canadians, and about 13% are over the age of 65. And about 350,000 of them have Alzheimer's disease. That's today. 6 years from now, as the baby boomers get over the age of 65, you're going to have senior citizens outnumbering children under the age of 15 for the first time in the history of Canada. And in 25 years, there are going to be 50% more senior citizens than there will be children under the age of 50. By 2050, that's 41 years from now, 30% of Canadians will be over the age of 65. 1 in 10 will be over 80. Half of those will have Alzheimer's disease in early stages or developed stages. So we're talking about more than 1 million Canadians having some form of dementia by about 2050 out of a population that'll be around 40, 42 million. So literally, every family in Canada potentially could be affected by this.
And as you look at it, first of all, I don't know whether to be more impressed with the information about these diseases you're telling us or the fact that you knew Canada's population, which I bet you might be the only person in the U.S. to know. But anyway, be that as it may, the healthcare system we have in place today to deal with all of this, no doubt, is not ready for an epidemic of 3 to 4 times the size of what it is right now. So paint a picture of kind of what the future looks like that we'll need in order to treat this kind of situation.
You raise an extremely important point. So let me give you some data for the United States, where the numbers are much bigger and the problem is going to be even worse. Right now, neurologic diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, stroke, and so forth cost the United States about $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. That's out of a total gross national product of $13 trillion. So that's a colossal expenditure, and it's going to increase by a factor of 3 or 4 over the next 40 years. You're going to see a similar problem in Canada, but scaled down by about a factor of 10, because that's the population difference. If we're going to avoid an economic catastrophe, because the healthcare system, as you quite correctly point out, simply can't deal with the volume of patients suffering from these diseases that we're going to have, we have to not only find ways to treat these diseases, we have to find ways to prevent them. If medical research is successful, what we really need to do is never let these diseases develop to the point where people require extensive health care in the first place. We need to be able to identify people at risk for developing the diseases and stop the disease from ever getting started. Because, for example, with Parkinson's disease, by the time you first show any symptoms, you've already lost about half of the neurons in the particular part of the brain that's affected. And that's too much damage. Repairing it, even with something like stem cell therapy, is going to be extremely expensive. So what's desperately needed are ways to identify these diseases early, identify people who are at risk for these diseases, and then find ways to prevent the diseases from developing. If we can do that, the problem will not only not expand to the kind of levels I'm talking about, but we could save literally tens to hundreds of billions of dollars a year in lost wages, medical costs, social costs, burdens on the family, and so forth.
How far away do you think we are from that?
I would have said a few years ago that we were a considerable way away, but I've seen some data recently that give me some hope that some of these diseases, Parkinson's maybe especially, we might be much closer to finding ways to arresting it or preventing it than I thought we were before. If we're really lucky, maybe we're 10 years, 15 years away from some significant breakthroughs. At least that's what I hope, because the clock's ticking for everybody.
Well, that's it. It sounds as if governments in particular, and all of us in general, are hugely dependent on folks like you coming up with something in the next very short while, because unless I'm reading you incorrectly, it doesn't sound like there's any way in the world we're going to be able to transform our healthcare system on either side of the border to be able to take care of the huge numbers of people who are going to be dealing with this if we don't get that kind of solution. Is that right?
That's the way I see it. I can't imagine a scenario in which healthcare costs come down enough to support the enormous increase in elderly people that we're going to see. Because remember, age isn't just a risk factor for neurologic disease, it's a risk factor for almost everything bad. Cancer rates go up with age, heart disease rates go up with age, stroke rates go up with age, and so forth. So we really need to get at these problems from the point of biomedical research. I think that's our best bet.
Okay, if you look at the two ways, though, people approach this, prevention and cure, how are our resources being expended today on each side of the equation?
In my opinion, our resources aren't being expended well on either side. There's relatively little work going on in terms of prevention, and the work on finding cures, though it's accelerated recently, still lags way behind our efforts in other diseases like cancer and so forth. Even some of the infectious diseases like AIDS, we're spending more money on those than we are on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease right now. You probably have heard of the Michael J. Fox Foundation.
For sure.
Set up by the actor Michael J. Fox for Parkinson's disease because he himself contracted the disease. Well, the first year the Michael J. Fox Foundation went into business and started funding any Parkinson's disease research. As you can imagine, being a private foundation, they didn't have a lot of money to spend. They still spent more money than the United States government did on Parkinson's disease. That's changed now, but that gives you an idea of how underserved these health problems are.
On the other hand, how do you tell somebody who's, looking into heart disease or lung disease or AIDS that we're going to take money away from you and give it to these guys? I mean, they think they've got a good case too, don't they?
They absolutely do, and I'm not saying that's what we should do. What I'm saying is I think we're underspending on biomedical research in general, and additional money we should make an effort to target towards these underserved areas of disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. I mean, to be fair, since I work in those areas, this is a somewhat self-serving comment, and since I'm 60 years old, it's really a self-serving comment because the clock's ticking for me too. Nevertheless, I think that's really what we've got to do.
Okay, in our last couple of minutes, I wonder if you could share with us some ideas that you've come across where people can actually change their behavior, change what they do, change how they live in order to, as you suggested before, just try and avoid this from happening in the first place.
Yeah, there's no simple procedure that will guarantee you won't get any of these diseases. Some of this is random, and that's hard for people to appreciate. Some of it's just the luck of the draw, and you can be unlucky.
You got to pick your parents well, don't you?
That helps enormously. I loved mine, but the fact of the matter is, in some cases you could still come up with a bad card in the deck. Nevertheless, there are some things you can do to bring down your risk. So let me tell you what those are. For Alzheimer's disease, the biggest thing you can do to keep your risk as low as possible is to keep your blood pressure from being high. Chronic high blood pressure, the biggest single risk factor we've identified for Alzheimer's disease. It's also, by the way, a significant risk factor for glaucoma, which is sort of like Alzheimer's disease of the eye. Another thing you can do is not have chronic high cholesterol. The connection there is not as firmly established as it is for blood pressure, but the data look pretty good that chronic levels of what's called bad cholesterol, right?
Mm-hmm. As opposed to the good cholesterol.
Yeah, exactly, are in fact a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And there are preventative measures you can take. So one of the things you can do is you can keep yourself mentally stimulated. But hey, the audience is watching this, so you've got that covered. And the second thing that you can do to minimize your risk besides the factors I've just been talking about, as far as we know, exercise also has a beneficial effect. It's hard to quantify, but it looks like that's a good thing too.
So after the program's over, we'll tell them to turn the TV off and go work out.
Yeah, but stay till the end.
Stay till the end, definitely.
Yeah, or at least of my segment. Now, as far as Parkinson's disease is concerned, one thing we know that actually is protective is caffeine. We don't know why caffeine is protective, but we know that it is. It does help to have a steady, regular intake, not enormous amounts, but of caffeine. So go ahead and have that extra latte. It's probably a good thing for you. On the other hand, there are things you should avoid. Head injuries, a tremendous risk factor for neurologic diseases, especially Parkinson's disease. So wear a helmet when you're on your bicycle or a motorcycle. Don't do prize fighting, leave that to Sylvester Stallone, and, you know, maybe the only kind of significant thing you should be doing that might cause your head to come into contact with another object would be jumping to conclusions. I think you might be a little careful about that.
I'm looking forward to seeing you on the Borscht Belt one of these days. You're not only brilliant, but you're funny, too.
Appreciate that.
Dr. Plesko, it's good of you to join us. Gregory Petsko, Professor of Biochemistry, Brandeis University. Thanks so much for being there on the line from Waltham, Massachusetts.
Thanks for having me. Good night.
Online at the agenda this week, the mysteries of the mind.
What we found was that people who were bilingual get dementia, but got it on average 4 years later than people who are monolingual.
Web-exclusive video from Baycrest, how the bilingual brain can slow the development of dementia. Plus, our interactive brain page. Brain games and a brain mythbuster quiz. The mysteries of the mind, unraveled all week long on the agenda and online anytime on Twitter, Facebook, and at tvo.org/theagenda. Up next.
This is Pebbles, the world's first robotic student.
I can move the camera, zoom in.
Digital natives and digital immigrants. The digital generation gap and your brain. That's next on the agenda. It looks like a day around here sometimes, you know. Anyway, joining us now on the debate in Los Angeles, California, Gary Small, author of iBrain, Surviving the Technological Alteration of the Modern Mind. In Montreal, Quebec, Amir Raz, a Canada Research Chair in the Cognitive Neuroscience of Attention at McGill University. And here in studio, Don Tapscott, 13 books, author most recently of Grown Up Digital, How the Net Generation is Changing Your World. Barbara Arrowsmith-Young, director of the Arrowsmith School, a private school for people with learning disabilities, and Robert Sawyer, the award-winning science fiction writer. Good to have everybody, both here in studio and in Points Beyond for our discussion tonight. Gary, I want to start with you, spend a couple of minutes with you, because you've studied people's brains while they're using the internet. What were you trying to discover?
Well, we wanted to understand what happens to the brain during this very common technology experience. And the first step was to find people who were naive to the experience, because it would tell us some information about that. And it was quite interesting. It was quite a challenge, actually, to figure out how to do this task. We used functional MRI scanning, and that allows us to see how the brain changes from moment to moment, but you can't get a computer into the narrow tube of the scanner. So we had to use these specialized goggles and present simulated web pages to the volunteers. And we compared people who were naive to internet use to those who were net savvy. And it was quite an interesting result.
What'd you find out?
We found out that when people read a book page, they activate the areas of the brain you'd expect, areas that control vision, language ability, reading, and so forth. But when you had them search online, at least simulate that experience, we saw a much greater extent of activity, but only in people who had prior experience. In fact, it was a twofold greater extent of activity, and we especially saw it in the frontal lobe of the brain, the thinking brain that allows us to make decisions from moment to moment. And that made sense to us, because when you think about searching online, it's a very interactive decision-making process.
And you infer from that 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 is therefore automatically a good thing?
Well, those were the headlines that Google makes you smart. And I don't think it's that simple. I think the brain is complex and the technology is complex. I think that what we see is that when we're presented with an unfamiliar mental task, that our neural circuits don't quite know how to deal with it. And on functional MRI, we don't see an obvious pattern. However, when people figure out a mental strategy, such as searching online, then we see greater activation. However, we've seen in other studies, and others have found this as well, when a mental task becomes automatic or routine, then we actually see less activity, suggesting that there's brain efficiency.
Okay, that's your work, which you describe in your latest book, iBrain. We've got another author over here, Don Tapscott, who, as I suggested, has 13 books out there. His latest is called Grown Up Digital, and I want to read an excerpt of that and then go to you with a question, Don. Here is it. We're entitling this excerpt, Kids These Days. You talk about your daughter. My daughter, Nikki, he says, is a great example of this hyper-connected generation. She prefers to work at our kitchen table when she's not traveling on a work assignment, even though she has a killer office set up in her bedroom. She says she'd rather be, quote, where the action is, working while dealing with the dog, having her parents come in and out, rooting in the refrigerator, window for work documents open, multiple internet windows open for research, IM, instant messaging, and Facebook windows open for communication, and earbuds for music. Still, she was a straight-A student and is a rising star at the consulting company where she now works. Now, Don, I hate to sound like an old fogey here, but how the hell does she do all of those things at once?
Well, first of all, what we know about growing up and the effect on the brain is that for my generation, I watch 24 hours a week of television. And for her generation, time online is taken away from watching TV. And when they come home, they don't turn on the TV, they turn on their computer. And they're in 3 different windows talking to their friends, listening to MP3 files with 3 magazines open. And like Nikki, they're doing their work. And the television's going on in the background, but it's sort of like ambient media. It's like music. And as Gary just pointed out, and as he's explained in his wonderful book, the way you spend your time when you're growing up affects the development of your brain. And if you grow up watching television for 24 hours a week, you get a certain kind of brain. And if you grow up interacting, collaborating, composing your thoughts, searching for stuff, organizing information, telling your stories, that shapes your brain as well. So the reason that she can multitask and I can't, from what we know, is that she has better active working memory and she has better switching abilities. It looks like she's doing all these things at once, but she's not. She's actually moving between them much more effortlessly than I can.
Amir Raz, I wonder if you'd give us the view from Montreal. Was it better for our brains when it was one thing, television, that's all we had to worry about, or this new generation, where, as Don says, it's not necessarily 6 things all at once, but certainly 6 windows open, 6 functions happening pretty much all at the same time?
Right. Well, I think it's important to understand that attention in general is not a unitary thing. It's not a monolithic entity that is called attention. There are different types of attention. We have identified with scientific experiments different types of attention, and we can actually demonstrate that developmentally or across age, as we mature, we are capable of doing certain things better at certain ages and other things not so great at other ages. And there is something to be said about catering certain activities to certain ages in addition to the actual activities themselves. In addition to that, there are huge individual differences in the way that we attend and in attending styles or in attention styles. So attention can come in many flavors, even if we're talking about atypical forms of attention, such as hypnosis or meditation, which are also sort of attention types that we sometimes don't think about as attention types. We think about them as altered states of consciousness or something like that, but they're all really within a particular spectrum of attention.
Amir, are humans by nature good multitaskers?
In general, they are, but there's a limit on this resource that is called attention. It's not an infinite resource, and therefore some people are more efficient than others.
Okay, this is all, of course, a relatively new phenomenon, and this is where I want to bring Barbara into the discussion right now, because you run a school for children with learning disabilities, and I guess one wonders how the influence of all of this, videos, instant messaging, the internet, video games, everything that, television, let's not forget television, MP3 players, how's that having an impact on the students who come through your door?
Well, I can't say for certain that it has had an impact. What I can say is over the 30 years that I've been doing this work, I've seen a change in the kind of student that's walking through the door, the kind of learning dysfunction. 30 years ago, I was reading Lurie's work, description of, he's a neuroscientist, the frontal lobes, and thinking I really was excited. I wanted to see some individuals that were coming through the door with that difficulty. At that time, in the late 70s, maybe 1% of the students that I was seeing would have executive function. The thinking, problem solving is a very specific kind of attention. What I'm seeing now is 60% of the students that I'm dealing with are walking through the door with significant executive function difficulty. Can I say that that's a result of technology? I can't, but something has happened over those intervening years that is leading to more students that I'm seeing, and obviously I'm seeing a selected population. I'm seeing students that are struggling with difficulties. I'm not seeing an increased incidence in children with reading problems, with dyslexia, with auditory processing, visual memory, but specifically executive function.
But that's what we want to know. Can we draw a direct line between, for example, attention deficit disorder and all these different things that Don Tapscott's daughter is doing at once?
Well, maybe in the population that I'm dealing with, maybe there's a predisposition to difficulty, and they're not getting the stimulation. I mean, they're not getting sort of that active engagement. They're flitting from one thing to another, possibly. And part of what I believe that drives the prefrontal cortex is that it's the novelty, but it's the active engagement, it's the thinking, the problem solving, the digging into something, the investigating, and possibly part of the way that the technology can be used is to counter that, so that it's not possibly stimulating in this population that area. But I mean, technology is just a tool, and it's really how one uses the tool, and it can be possibly misapplied or misused.
I wondered if already during the course of tonight's discussion, Robert, you have a new plot for a new book.
Well, I do, but I think it's actually an old plot. You asked Amir if we were natural multitaskers. We went through this period where we came up with our tests and standards for what cognitive function should be, and it happens to coincide with the period in which we watched a lot of television. The late 50s to the late 90s established our norms. That was an aberrant period in human history where we actually spent a large number of hours staring at a single thing and absorbing ourselves in it. On the African savannah, where we came from, we had to be multitaskers. We were hunting and gathering and on the outlook for predators from above, eagles and things like that, predators in the grass, snakes, all sorts of things. We had to be constantly attentive to various input sources. We actually evolved to do that, and there was this aberrant period where we gave that up to become addicted to the boob tube. Now that we've moved beyond that, yes, the idea that somebody could focus their attention for hours on end on a single task, that's the metric that we measure right now. We don't do it as well as we used to when that's what we grew up doing, but that may not be the natural human state, and it may not be the most productive use of our brains. Don.
Yeah, I think that the way we think about attention is changing, and Amir was alluding to this. Like, if these kids have attention deficit disorder, how come their IQ is at an all-time high among young people? How come SAT scores have gone up, even though the number of kids taking the SAT has also grown, which should have dropped SAT? How come our universities are graduating more students than ever, and the admission standards at universities are at an all-time high? That, how come a youngster can sit there focused like a laser on a video game for 3 hours and we say they have attention deficit disorder? The issue here is, what is attention? And my daughter's performing spectacularly, but she's doing all these things at once. I was talking to Jim Quigley, the CEO of Deloitte, and I said, is this true the kids can't focus? They're the so-called dumbest generation ever. And he said to me, no, they're the smartest generation ever. And I said, well, give me some data. He says, well, it's easy. We're a consulting company. They bill more and they have happier clients than any other generation. Case closed. Case closed.
That's it. Gary, is there a direct line that you can draw between multitasking and a lack of focus, attention deficit disorder, call it what you want?
I think it's very difficult to prove cause and effect in these kinds of situations. And you see, if you just take attention deficit as an example, there's a lot of controversy in this area. There are many studies showing an association between worse symptoms of ADHD, even poor performance in school, and more time with technology. In fact, those kinds of data have led the American Academy of Pediatrics to recommend no technology exposure for children under 2 years of age. Now, not all pediatricians agree with that. And I think, you know, we hear this debate. You know, people will tell me when I talk about my book, some people will say, well, my grandma told me television would rot my brain, and it never happened. And so I think we tend to polarize the issues rather than look at the big picture. And I think the big picture is that technology is not all bad and it's not all good. And we need to parse out what it's really doing, trying to understand how it's affecting the brain. And to get back to, you know, the question of ADHD, probably for some kids it is important. It does make things worse, but for others it may not.
Barbara, do you have techniques that you employ? Is there a conventional wisdom on that child who just doesn't seem to be able to focus on one task, how you get them to do that and focus?
Well, I have a number of different programs that I believe are working different cognitive areas, and it's really getting the student to actively engage with the task, to focus on it, and to work towards mastery. So it's really by going in and working over and over again, kind of self-reflecting, checking for mistakes. It's sort of actively engaging, I believe, you know, the executive function, the prefrontal cortex, to have to keep going in and digging into the material to see what they're missing, what isn't working, kind of problem solving.
We've learned a lot this week about the plasticity of the brain, how it is a constantly evolving and changing thing, unlike what we thought, I guess, a few generations ago, which was, that was it. So do you actually teach your children to create new pathways in their brains, as it were?
Well, I mean, I can't exactly say that because I don't have access to the brain scan technology to go in and look at that. Certainly the work that I've developed came out of a lot of the research in the field of neuroscience. I mean, looking at the work that, you know, stimulation can actually, you know, create, whether it's new neural pathways, but increased neurotransmitters, actually change the brain at a physiological level. And I have a number of very specific targeted programs that are you know, putting stimulation into very different functions. So working on visual memory, auditory memory, thinking, problem solving, reasoning. But I mean, one of the hallmarks of the work is that there needs to be active engagement and attention. It's sort of antithetical to multitasking, to work these areas. And there's nothing wrong with multitasking. I love multitasking, but I believe for the work that I'm doing, I need to target and stimulate and go right into the area, and to get it actively working and processing and engaged. And we have certain criteria. There's got to be mastery, there's got to be 90% accuracy, there's got to be over a period of time that the person has to sustain the engagement, and it has to be consistent.
Okay, as part of the research for this program, I went to visit my grandmother today. My grandmother's 95 years old. She'll hate me for saying that, but she is. And she doesn't live too far away from here. And I went to talk to her. Amir, I'll bring you in on this. I went to talk to her today about email and MP3 players and, you know, all of the computer games that her great-grandchildren are playing these days. And she had no interest in it whatsoever. Couldn't have been less interested in what I was trying to talk to her about. Can you say, Amir, that there comes a point in someone's life where the brain is just completely not interested in kind of this multitasking that we're talking about, all of these new stimuli, for example?
I think that the general consensus today is that attention is certainly something that you can train, and you can learn things, including when you are very old. You might not learn with the same kind of alacrity and efficiency. It might be more difficult. You might need more repetitions, but there's no question that even the old brain is capable of learning new tricks. You know the stuff that they say about dogs and tricks. But the idea really is that there are vast individual differences between people, and then there are predilections and personal tastes, and some people might not, you know, connect with technology. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not good at multitasking. They might have some difficulties with certain kinds of technology. When we look at results in the lab, and when we look at even ecological results, we can demonstrate time and again that individuals at many diverse ages are capable of learning, although slightly differently as a function of age.
Don?
You know, well, first of all, if I were 95, I'd be proud, so your grandmother shouldn't be embarrassed. But I view this as sort of the opposite as the way the conversation is going. That young people who don't get access to this interactive experience are going to be at a severe disadvantage. You know, because 10, 20 years from now, let's face it, there will be no physical newspapers. People will interact with news content through screens.
They have been saying that for a long time, been predicting that for a long time.
Next week I'm speaking to the Publishers Association, and they're telling me that the industry is cratering right now. You look at Time magazine and how many ads are in it, and the answer is like 2. So I was talking to this youngster who was at a meeting that I was at. He was 22 years old. His name is Joe O'Shea, and he said to a group of educators, "I don't read books." And they were kind of shocked when he said that. And he said, I think I know what's in books, but I access information differently. And, you know, I get information off the net, and if I have a physical book, I access it like a website. So after the meeting, I got to know him, and I spent some time with him. He's an extraordinary youngster. He's the president of the Students' Council at, this is Florida State University. He set up the Global Peace Exchange that involves 70 countries around the world.
So not a dumb guy.
Yeah, and well, actually, next year, he told me he's so excited because he's going to London to study. He's doing a Master's of Philosophy at Oxford.
Okay, he's going to have to read a book when he goes there.
Well, it turns out that he did. But the punchline of the story is that I said, that's great, because he was came from a poor family. I said, you got a scholarship or something? He says, yeah, I do. I got a full funding. It's called a Rhodes Scholarship. So the only Rhodes Scholar from Florida this year doesn't read books.
Amazing.
So there's something fundamental that's changing here in terms of how we interact with content.
Well, we have to be very careful, too. If I asked your sainted grandmother if she wanted to go to a nightclub where they're having a rave with me, she would not. In fact, I would not want. But if you offer her email and say, all the young people are on it, you're offering her the same thing, a way to interact with a group that doesn't interest her. And if you say to somebody, I don't know how your grandmother's hearing is, but you say to the average person in their 90s, here's a great way to listen to music. Their response to that, or forgive me, just about anything else is, I'm sorry, I had trouble hearing what you were saying. You're offering carrots that have no appeal to people at that group. If you said everybody you know who is 90 is on email, that's appealing. If you say everybody who's in their 20s is doing this, that doesn't appeal to people in their 90s. We also know you're dealing with people who have a demonstrable learning difficulty. So I set your classroom situation aside. But we see just today, MIT announced that it's dispensing with giant classes for its introductory physics lectures because they've determined that that's not an effective learning model anymore. We have a lot of people who are performing poorly in classrooms, and we're giving huge diagnoses, huge percentage diagnoses to the students and saying there's something wrong with the students. I don't think so. I think there's something wrong with most of the instructors. They've got people coming into their rooms who are used to being highly stimulated in multiple ways simultaneously, and you have an old so-and-so at the front of the room droning on as if all he's doing is reading a textbook out loud. It's an outdated model. The model of how we teach is what's failing. It's not our students that are failing.
Well, in fact, the students that I talk to, the smartest kids in the U.S. now, the thing is to get an A and to never go to a lecture. Because the model of pedagogy is all wrong for this generation. They've grown up interacting and collaborating and multitasking, and we have this thing called the lecture, you know. I'm a student, or I'm a teacher, I have knowledge, you're a student, you're an empty vessel, you don't. Get ready, here it comes. And it's one way, it's one size fits all, it's teacher focused, and the student is isolated in the learning process.
Gary, I see you trying to get in on this.
I want to jump in. I feel a little bit like I'm technologically challenged because I'm looking right at a camera here and I can't get a sense of that. And I think it speaks to what's driving this debate. In a sense, the problem is that our technology is not upgraded enough. I mean, there's a huge difference between a face-to-face human contact conversation and doing something video conferencing like I'm doing right now, or sending an email or doing an IM. Much different approach. In the future, we may have a virtual hologram, so you can't tell the difference of whether you're actually in the studio or not. So I think that will change. And I think a concern I have right now is that because even though the technology allows us to communicate instantaneously, it allows us to gather all this information anytime, any place. It's remarkable what we can do. The concern is that we're losing our basic human contact skills, and we're not making wise choices when to use technology information transfer versus picking up the phone versus walking in the room and talking with someone.
Well,
sometimes the best answer to a string of emails is, let's talk.
this is very interesting that you brought this up at this time, because it very nicely segues us right into where we want to go right now, and that's an excerpt of your book, Gary. This is from iBrain. A recent Kaiser Foundation study found that young people 8 to 18 years of age expose their brains to 8.5 hours of digital and video sensory stimulation each day. The investigators reported that most of the technology exposure is passive, such as watching televisions and videos, that's 4 hours daily, or listening to music, 1 hour and 45 minutes, while other exposure is more active and requires mental participation, such as playing video games, that's 50 minutes daily, or using the computer, 1 hour. And since you brought it up, Gary, let me ask you to follow up on that. What do you think the implications are of this more TV, more video, more iPods, less face-to-face human contact on the current generation?
Well, I think it's a problem. I think, you know, we've heard about some of the positives of the technology and the way it really augments our brains and our communication skills. But my concern is there can be negatives. Now, there was a study that came out after iBrain that is quite interesting, where they looked at volunteers, about 200 students, about teenagers and young adults, and they gave them a task of recognizing the emotional content of a facial expression. So that this neutral face morphed into either an angry face or a happy face. And they found that when they played a video game before the morphing experiment, that it took them longer to recognize the happy face. So we don't have a lot of science on it, but I can tell you what I observe in my own kids, in people I talk to, in patients, and that is that when we spend too much time with the technology, we're not looking at people in the eye. We're not noticing the subtle nonverbal cues. When I speak to parent groups at schools, the parents are complaining. The employers are complaining that the new digital natives who are coming into the workforce don't have those basic human contact skills. I think the people who will really succeed in the future are those who master both the technology skills and, I guess, the old school approach of sitting down and looking somebody in the eye and talking to them face to face.
Barbara, then Robert.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly seeing, again, in the population that I deal with, which are children with learning disabilities, but an increase in nonverbal problems, where exactly what Gary's saying, that they're having trouble reading social skills, their social cues, misinterpreting social cues, students that just don't anticipate and plan socially. And again, whether that's due to too much time spent in front of the technology and not enough in terms of interaction, but real problems. And I mean, and it affects dating, it affects all of like social interaction, making friends, misreading, feeling that they're bullied when they're really not being bullied because they're misreading the cues. All sorts of difficulties, and I would say that is a significant complaint that parents have, because they want their children, at least if they're struggling academically, but to be able to fit into the world socially, and if they can't read those cues, it's a real problem.
Robert, then Amir.
Socialization is very important, but I want to take a note of the fact that we're here in Toronto, the hometown of Marshall McLuhan, and you can't take all electronic media and throw them into one bucket as if they were the same thing. There's a huge difference between hot and cold media, between the passivity of watching television and the interactivity of sitting in front of a computer and Googling and having multiple windows open. And we just saw in the quote from Gary's book that, we have this huge number of hours that we spend looking at screens, but screens are not all created equal, and each of them plays to a different part of our psychological armament.
Just to comment on that, I've heard myself shout across our house to my son saying, "Harry, get off that video game and come down and watch television with me." So, I think that point is extremely well taken.
Amir, can I hear you on this?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to point out a few things that are not sort of as part of the conversation as yet. One is that the field of attention, the scientific field of attention, is one of the most central in psychology. And has been going on for well over 100 years. And we actually know a great deal about the workings of attention and the limitations of human attention and so on. What we don't have at the moment is sort of an applied interface, or how to take some of this knowledge and to use it in the real world using, the technology that we have today. However, having said that, it's important to understand that we have budding efforts. We have some very nascent, interesting, beginning efforts to show how you can train attention with technology. So, for example, there have been some very important studies in recent years, as in 2-3 years ago, showing, for example, that children diagnosed with ADHD can benefit tremendously from certain attention training that is done with a computer, with joystick, with certain kinds of computer-like games or computer games that are geared. They're not just computer games that you buy at a store, but they were developed by brain scientists in order to target the areas that are involved in certain inhibitory processes or certain areas that are important for emotional regulation, for cognitive control. And we have tremendous results with these things. The same was done also in Europe, by the way. This is a North American effort in Europe. In Sweden, for example, there were interesting studies showing that training working memory, which is also a sort of a form of attention, you can achieve tremendous results with children who have all kinds of behavioral difficulties. They can gain better control over their behavior without medication. And this is something that is really interesting because this is a situation where technology is actually used therapeutically. And that's something that we sometimes sort of ignore, and we use technology as something that is more leisurely or more fun or more passive, as some of the discussion has been pointing out. But there's also a content element, and if you harness technology cleverly and wisely, you can actually use it therapeutically and in interventions that are very helpful to certain behavioral situations.
Don.
Just to follow up on Rob's comment, the decline in face-to-face communication. I spent $4 million researching this topic of technology and young people. I found no evidence that there's a decline. And what's happening is that time online is not taken away from hanging out with your friends or learning the piano or talking to your parents or doing your homework. It's largely taken away from television. And there's a methodology problem with some of these studies that they add up time on TV, time on video games, time on the internet and computers and so on. But a lot of these are activities happening at the same time, where the television is a passive background activity. And I think it's unquestionable that we're talking about in the 20s of hours per week. My generation watched TV. These kids interact with media. But there's a big change in the screen. And the most fundamental thing to understand this whole topic is that a TV screen is the antithesis of a screen where you're interacting and being caused to think and remember things.
I get that, but tell me this. I read a story once about a mother who, when she called her son for supper, she sent him a text message because that was his preferred method of communication, rather than, I guess, like we used to do in the old days, she'd scream up the stairs. Is that a good thing?
I don't know. I didn't like my mom screaming up the stairs. I would have way rather had a text message myself.
Well, no, I'm not asking.
The kids have got it right, if you ask me.
That's his preferred method of communication, and therefore, so be it.
I know, and you could say that the television was the electronic hearth and brought the family together, but past the popcorn grunt, was hardly a meaningful kind of interaction.
But I presume, it would be a terrible irony if this younger, brighter, more multitasking, much more clever generation, if the sort of taken to the nth degree, the result was that they weren't able to speak face to face to other people now because they were just so plugged into technology.
I see no evidence.
You don't see it happening.
There's a decline in that capability.
Even if that was, I agree with Don that there is no evidence, but even if that were happening, what we've had, and you always have to look at whose power base is being threatened by a change. What we have is a world right now where the handsome and the glib succeed, whether they're intelligent or whether they're right. They succeed in the workplace, they succeed in politics, they succeed in television and so forth. TVO accepted.
Trying not to take that personally.
TVO accepted. But online, actually, the one interesting thing about this particular technological epoch we live in, where it's a low bandwidth text communication for most of it, is it's the great leveler. It's all that matters is how clever and witty and profound you are in what you say. Not what you look like, not if you're wearing the most recent fashions, not if you're good looking, not if you're in shape or out of shape, not what race, gender, ethnicity, age you are, just how much you have. It is Martin Luther King's great statement. It is the content of your character that comes through online.
About 4 minutes to go here. Let me put one more thing on the table. Nowadays, we don't have to memorize a lot of stuff that we used to have to memorize. We don't have to memorize the periodic table. We don't have to memorize people's phone numbers. We can go online to find the periodic table. The phone numbers are automatically plugged into our cell phones. We do have to memorize other stuff. PIN numbers, for example, we have to memorize, which we didn't have to do when we were children. So, Gary, to you first, do we have to keep more or less information in our brains nowadays?
You know, I think it's hard to quantitate that. It's different kinds of information. And so I think what we're hearing in this discussion is that the way we communicate, the way we think is changing. I mean, we can't, you know, we're having emotional reactions to it. The other day, I was talking to my daughter, and she was texting while I was talking. I said, you know, Rachel, I don't, you know, when you don't look at me, I don't feel like you're really paying attention. So it had an emotional impact on me. She looked up and then went back to her texting. So, you know, so I think
did she get what you were saying?
That's right.
Did she get what you were saying?
She did. I think she did to some extent, but you know, with my son, it has a bigger impact. I mean, he's red-eye brain, and he feels it's transformed his life, which is remarkable to me, because I really wrote it more for the digital immigrants, for those of us who are struggling with, you know, the new technology, having grown up in a non-digital world. So I think that it's, you know, it's great that we're talking about this. I wish I were in the studio right now.
We'll have you here next time. I'm going to cut you off here because I've got 3 minutes left. I want to hear everybody on this. Don, how about it? More or less information in the brain that we have to retain these days?
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain hurts a lot these days. And I think that there's a lot of memory activity that goes on. And there's this whole view that Google makes you stupid because you don't have to remember anything. And I don't really buy that. And I think that what's happening is there's a fundamental challenge to our educational system. It's based on, you know, kids retaining information, learning facts, being able to recall them on tests. And when you look at the economy these kids are going into, it's not only what you know when you graduate, it's your capacity to think and to solve problems and to communicate and to maybe multitask and to organize your thoughts and so on. And to me, the young people that have access to all this are getting a better experience that's more helpful.
Amir, let me hear you on that.
I think that the main difference is not so much in the size of the information, the quantity of information per se, although of course there might be a variation there, but it's in the level of processing. I think we are required today of a higher cognitive load. We are required to deal with information in a very different way than we did before. Some of the examples of, you know, of memorizing certain things. Memorizing is one, you know, facet or one aspect of information, regurgitating information. But we are today, we're living in a high-paced world where cognition or working with information cognitively is of the utmost importance. And when we need to interpret an email that we're getting, it's a whole new set of skills. One thing, you know, there's certain subtextual information that we need to extract and buzzwords that people are using and so on. There's a whole level, a whole different world of cognitive processing that we need to acquire, and I think that in that respect the load is higher.
Okay, 20 seconds left to each of you. Barbara, you want to go first on this?
I would agree with Amir. I think, I mean, we're now able to be exposed to so much more information and make connections and interrelations with all of the material that does place a higher cognitive load, and it's really learning how to learn and the ability to think and problem solve and learn that's critical. And that
Robert J.
Albert Einstein didn't know his own phone number. Sherlock Holmes famously didn't know that the Earth revolves around the sun. Why? Because these were irrelevant trivia. If he had to know them for something, he would look them up. We do well now to emulate their genius. You don't pack your brain full with facts and figures. You train it to be able to find and synthesize everything that's out there.
You know, there's a reason we'd like to have you on this program. You really sum it up quite beautifully.
My pleasure.
And I bet you there's a book in this show tonight.
Absolutely.
I bet you there is. Gary Small, author of iBrain, Amir Raz, the neuroscientist from McGill University. Thanks so much to both of you for being on the line from Points Beyond. Don Tapscott, author of Grown Up Digital, 13th book. Thanks a lot for being here tonight, Don. Barbara Aerosmith Young from the Aerosmith School. Robert J. Sawyer, the award-winning science fiction author. Great to have you two alongside as well.
Thank you.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program was produced by Mark Brosens and Meredith Martin. And you could read Meredith's post on technology in the brain on our Inside Agenda Producers blog. You'll find that online at tvo.org/theagenda. Next stop, Kingston. This season, we're taking the agenda on the road to explore the changing nature of Ontario's regional economies and what that means to you. The Agenda on the Road is a series of two-day interactive specials that combines web-based social media and live television, all in a local setting. Our third stop is Kingston, where on January 18th and 19th, we'll take a closer look at Ontario's agricultural sector. It may be snowy out there, but for those who make their living from the earth, spring is never far away. On Sunday, we'll host Agenda Camp, a community forum featuring leaders from industry, government, and local citizens. The Agenda team and I will be there to hear what you have to say about the challenges facing farmers and other agrarian-based businesses, and to help you create content for our website and for our live television broadcast the following night. Spaces are limited and filling up fast, so if you want to sign up for Agenda Camp or join our live TV audience, go to tvo.org/theagenda and click on the Agenda on the Road link. That's the Agenda on the Road, January 18th and 19th in Kingston, Ontario. We hope to see you there. And that is the agenda for Wednesday, January 14th, 2009. Tomorrow night, anger, violence, and the brain. If we know what kind of people are prone to violence, should we do something about it? Remember, the Mysteries of the Mind, and all the Agenda programs for that matter, are available online anytime in streaming video and audio or video podcast. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin was presented by
Vale Inco Limited, a pioneering nickel mining company transforming mineral resources into essential ingredients for everyday life. Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at casforchange.ca.
Stephen Wiltshire was mute.